Hi everyone, welcome to the November 13th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to do some handicapping from around the country. There's not really one circuit to focus on, and the stakes races are really scattered about. So we're going to hop around a little bit. We're going to start out at Aqueduct to discuss their two stakes races there on Saturday, the Notebook and the R.D. Schiller Stakes, hoping that latter one stays on the turf. We'll also discuss another two-year-old race from Sunday at Aqueduct, or rather a turf race from Sunday at Aqueduct. Then we'll move on to a few other venues out in California. We'll do the Desi Arnaz Stakes for the two-year-olds. Staying with the two-year-olds, we'll also discuss the James F. Lewis at Laurel. And finally, we'll finish up at Churchill Downs with the, I think, only graded stakes race this weekend. That's the Grade 2 Mrs. Revere on the turf for the three-year-old fillies. But Craig, we've got a pretty wide palette of races to go over this week with coming down from the Breeders' Cup. I know typically this is a quiet time in horse racing before things sort of pick back up for the Cigar Mile weekend, but I don't think either of us mind that lull too much.
No, it's actually a nice breath of fresh air, especially with the Triple Crown races having come just before the Breeders' Cup this year. So it's been a long grind, but I'm looking forward to this weekend. This is kind of my thing. I'm definitely more of a vertical type guy, and it's how I attack races generally. So I kind of like doing the shotgun approach, picking races from various locales like this.
And let's dive right in and start things out in New York on Saturday with the Notebook Stakes. It'll be race 7 on that card for the two-year-old New York breds, this one going 6 furlongs. And Craig, I thought this was a pretty wide open field. You've got horses coming in from a few different directions, some stepping up out of maiden victories. I'm guessing that the public is going to go for the horse on the outside, the number 7 Blue Gator. He's undefeated so far in his career, hasn't really gotten a test yet. That last victory was at Finger Lake, so he's going to have to transfer that form to New York, but he did run a pretty fast race. Just might have to do it over a fast track on Saturday.
Right. And I was going to say 2 for 2. I hate that undefeated when they've only run a couple times, but it's not wrong. So I'm not going to bust your chops over that. But yeah, I mean, he looks okay for sure. He ran a 99 TimeformUS speed figure last time out, which is the co-top in the field with second choice Eagle Orb. He did it at 6 furlongs, whereas Eagle Orb is turning back from a mile race. So if I had to pick among those two, I think I'd prefer Blue Gator. For one, he gets that good outside post at 6 furlongs. He's a horse who hasn't had to be on the lead, though he's obviously shown really good tactical speed. So I don't have any real knocks on him other than the price. Eagle Orb, I'm not as big a fan as the second choice on the morning line, even though he ran that same 99 speed figure. I mean, I guess the turn back makes sense. He kind of got tired setting a solid pace, I guess I would say. It wasn't anything special on a clear lead, and he still was able to get run down. So the turn back makes sense from that perspective. But going all the way back to 6 just seems a bit much to me. That's why I would prefer the 7. The horse I'll probably actually look to bet, though, is the 5-horse Horn of Plenty. He's a horse who I just kind of liked his debut. It's on the slow side for sure, and he's going to have to improve quite a bit. He only got a 76 Timeform speed figure that day, but these are two-year-olds, and big jumps aren't surprising. And I think if there's one thing I'd be confident in this race, it's that he'll be the one finishing the strongest.
Yeah, I think, see this race pretty similarly. I'm not against Blue Gator per se. I think he's shown some potential in his first couple of starts. I will say about that race he won at Finger Lakes last time, his main rival in there was Thin White Duke. I think he was the favorite. He ultimately finished third, but if you watch the start of that race, Thin White Duke reared up, I think, and spotted the field about 7 or 8 lengths. So there's an argument that Thin White Duke would have won that race had he not gotten left at the start. So just take that for what it's worth. Of the two favorites, assuming they are the favorites, I mean, I slightly preferred Eagle Orb. I thought that he ran well going the mile last time. That was a moderate pace, but he's shown that he could sprint in the past, and he didn't look totally comfortable to me raiding in behind horses when he did not run well too back in the Bertram F. Bongard. So I think the fact that they added the blinkers and injected a little more speed into him, I think that's helped him. So I expect him to run well here, even turning back. But Craig, I saw the same horse as you. I think that number 5, Horn of Plenty, is very interesting because horses. There does appear to be pace in this race, and he looks like the horse that has the best closing kick. I liked that professionalism that he showed first time out. It's not like he was sluggish at all. Dylan Davis had a ton of horse underneath him the entire way, but was just kind of in traffic, behind horses, not getting into trouble per se, but he just had to wait for room for a long time, and once he finally found room, he was down on the inside, had to alter course again at about the 8th pole to get around the leader, and I thought he finished up really strongly. Rob Rattress is not known for winning first time out, or really with 2-year-olds in general, but I think he's got a decent horse on his hands here, so I'd expect this one to run pretty well.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I tried to look up some stats for Rob Atras, but he just doesn't have a whole lot to go on. But there was nothing really negative to say this horse wasn't going to run an improved race. So he'd be the one for me. The one I'm not interested in is Looking for Trouble, who I think is the third choice on the morning line. He's a horse who is likely to be the early leader. He's always pretty quick early, but he will have plenty of company, and he hasn't shown a lot of heart. So if I was looking to be against one horse, it would be him.
Yeah, we're on the same page about that one. Moving on to another race on this Saturday card at Aqueduct, the 9th, the other stakes race. That is the Artie Schiller going a mile on the inner turf course. Now, if you've been watching Aqueduct this week, we're recording this on Friday. We've been off the turf the 2 racing days so far this week, Thursday and Friday, but the rain has subsided by now. So hopefully we'll at least be on the turf for this race on Saturday, although the turf course is probably going to be closer to yielding than firm. And we've got a couple horses here coming out of the Mohawk last time. Actually, a couple horses that faced off twice in a row, those being the New York breds, Rinaldi and Therapist. Now, you know what the name of the game is with Rinaldi. He gets sent to the front and just tries to wire these fields. He couldn't do that last time in the Mohawk because you had other speed in that race, namely Some Like It Hot Brown, who went the entire way on the front end. It does feel, though, like this time Rinaldi's going to get his preferred trip up front. I think it's just a matter of whether he's good enough to step up against open company.
Yeah, it's honestly almost like you were reading my notes on your introduction there. Rinaldi, we know what he's going to do. At least we should hope so. Sometimes we get surprised in New York, but I don't think that's going to happen with him. He's a horse who's going to go to the front. Our pace projector shows him as clear on the lead, and a race predicted to favor early speed. So he'd be the logical choice, but that said, I'm just not sure he's that good as a horse that I want to take a lowish price on, and I don't think we're going to get a big price. I mean, that label on the turf is just not what it is on dirt, in my opinion. Horses, when the pace slows down, tend to get into the race sooner if they need to. And so I'm just a little leery of taking 3-1 or maybe even less on him. He can certainly win. As you said, he ran into Some Like It Hot Brown last time, who's a grade 2 winner on the turf and open company. So I'm willing to put a line through that, but he still doesn't have any big edge when thing goes his way. So the horse I kind of wound up landing on was Hembry. He's a horse who just has better figures from me. His form's a little bit disguised because I think he's been running against better horses. He was in against Factor this last time. He was in an ungraded race at Kentucky Downs, but that race had a $300,000 purse. And he's actually run both of those last 2 races with over 120 TimeformUS speed figures. So for me, he's going to be my top pick anytime I get a horse like that. That's going to be probably 3rd or 4th choice at best. So Hembry for me.
Yeah, I've got no big problem with Hembry. I mean, he's not a horse that wins very often, but I think that's a problem with a lot of horses in this race once you get past Rinaldi. So you just kind of have to take that, and he will be a decent price in here. I do want to say briefly that Therapist, I would say, is the horse to beat. I just think Therapist is a better horse than Rinaldi, and maybe he's going to be compromised by the pace, but I think that's a question for everybody once you get past Rinaldi in here. And I know that he was beaten by him in that West Point 2-back. That was a race that they just kind of handed it to Rinaldi. Nobody showed any speed. There was other speed in the race. They just chose not to go. And I thought Therapist actually ran very well in the Mohawk last time behind Some Like It Hot Brown. That was the best performance we've seen out of Therapist in a long time. And I think the mile is a perfect distance for him. So I do think Therapist is a deserving favorite and should be a short price in this race. I just wanted to look for a little more value. So I landed on the number 3 Hawkish. I know it seems like Hawkish is off form, but I don't want to be too hard on him for that race at Kentucky Downs last time. Some horses just aren't Kentucky Downs horses. Also, they put blinkers on for the first time, and he was closer than expected to a pace that was pretty fast, or at least appeared to be pretty fast. I don't know how much stock I want to put in those fractional times at Kentucky Downs. And I know that Hembry ran by him in the late stages, but I'm just not putting a whole lot of stock in that form. And prior to that, Hawkish was running okay. He was second to the very good Sacred Life 2 back in Monmouth. And before that, I didn't think he got the best trip in the poker against a better field when he just kind of got held up in traffic in mid-stretch. I know it's been a while since we've seen really the best efforts out of Hawkish, but he'll be a price in this race. He handles a little bit of give in the ground, so I'll give him a shot to rebound.
Yeah, I've got no problem with Hawkish. He was going to be the other horse I mentioned. Certainly, Therapist is the horse to beat. I'm just a little leery of him at a shortish price. He's always a shortest price. I know he's won 8 of 20 starts career, but the vast majority of those came early in his career. And he just seems to be a horse that finds a way not to win lately. So no real knocks on him. He's a good horse, but I just don't want 5-2 or lower on him. The only other horse I'll mention out of these, of the two Chad Brown horses, I much prefer Delaware. I think he could be a little bit sneaky in here. He comes out of that Grade 2 King Edward at Woodbine where he lost a March to the Arch. And those were just better horses than he's going to face in here. So he's one as a fairly lightly raced 4-year-old, at least since he's come to the States. I think he could be one that could improve some.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Chad Brown horses because it feels like both of them could take a little bit of money in this race, and I just wasn't a big fan of either one. I guess I agree with you that Delaware is a little more appealing, though frankly, I haven't loved any of his races in this country, and valid point. I mean, we've talked about him a lot of times in the past because he's typically running him these big races on the turf. I've just never been a fan of this horse. I never have thought he's run particularly well or particularly fast, so this is a drop in class for him, but I just am not a fan of his. Moving on to Sunday at Aqueduct, staying on the turf, and I think there's a pretty good chance that this race will be on the turf with a couple days removed from the rain. This drew a pretty good field of 3-year-old fillies. You know, we're going to talk about 2 turf stakes for 3-year-old fillies on this show. One of them is a graded stakes at Churchill. I don't think that this one came up that much weaker than the other one that we're going to talk about in Kentucky in a little bit, though. I would imagine the favorite is going to be Speak to Me of Summer on the rail for Christophe Clement. She's been pretty consistent this year running in stakes company. She was second to the very visually impressive Chad Brown European import Tom Ahir last time. Had a little bit of traffic trouble in mid-stretch of that race before closing for second. I think with her, though, it really just depends on how the pace develops.
Yeah, and the pace projector doesn't see a whole lot of pace in here. It's a race where we show the favors early. We show the 5 duopoly on the lead in a nice, clear, easy lead. So for me, you have a little advantage. I don't have the morning line yet, at least when I checked this morning, but I think Duopoly is going to be pretty tough in here. Her last race, we don't have any pace figures at Keeneland. That's because they started using all those new run-ups and I just didn't have a baseline to go on. But if you pull up the chart, it's pretty telling that it was a race that just completely collapsed. All 3 of the horses that were up near the lead finished off the pace, and she was the winner of that small battle. And it wasn't like the pace horses were crazy long shots either. They were all at least reasonably bet. So I think it's just a race that fell apart. So I'm giving her an excuse there. The other horse I would mention, Vigilante's Way, she's done very little wrong, especially on turf, and she's actually coming out of what's proving to be a very strong race on Preakness Day. She's versatile, she's come from off the pace, and she has some good tactical speed when she needs to. So those 2 are the ones for me, depending on price, of course. A couple others I wanted to mention more in a negative way. There's a horse shipping in for Christophe Clement coming in from Italy named Facciolo, I guess is how you say it. That's a horse I'm just not interested in. These Euro shippers aren't really his specialty, and Italy racing is just not very strong. Her last race was a Group 3 in Italy, but that's probably more like a listed stakes or even lesser if you were looking at other countries like England or France or Ireland. So that one doesn't interest me, particularly given Clement's stats there. The other one who I think might take some money is Cristal. I know she had an excuse in her return. There was absolutely no pace whatsoever, but I think she's just always a horse who's been bet a little bit more than she should. She's never run particularly fast, and if she gets bet as I expect, I would be against her.
Yeah, I think we've got a similar view of the shorter prices. I made Duopoly the second choice on the line at 5-2. I think people are going to see that pace advantage that she has and is pretty obvious. There's just not a whole lot of speed in this race once you get beyond her. And I totally agree with your reception of the Valley View last time. We're going to talk about some more horses coming out of that race when we get to the Mrs. Revere later in the podcast. But I thought that the pace did fall apart and she was up close to it and just really couldn't finish off that race. Her prior effort at Saratoga was good enough to give her a shot in here. So she makes a lot of sense to me. And in some ways, I think she's the horse to beat. Though I'm making my top pick Vigilante's way. You make valid points about her last race at Pimlico. That was just a listed stakes, but horses have come back out of it and run well. It looked like a pretty tough race going into it, even though they just offered up a $100,000 purse. And I just think her two turf races suggest that she's a much better turf horse than she was on the dirt. I remember when she made her debut at Aqueduct last year and kind of making a mental note that this is a filly I want to look for eventually on the turf. Kind of lost track of her because she was racing at other circuits, not in New York. But she's got a big turf pedigree. She's a half-sister to Mr. Speaker, who won the Belmont Derby on the turf, as well as turf stakes winner Fire Away. She's also a half-to-snap Decision, who's turned into that very good steeplechase horse. So I just think she's finally doing what she wants to do. And in my opinion, she might have run the best race last time because she was a little bit out of position on the far turn, was the only horse making up ground at the end of that race. The horse that she beat when she won that race at Colonial Downs over the summer, Luck Money, she's since turned into a very good horse. She recently won a stakes race at Belmont. So I just think Vigilante's Ways for turf form is better than it looks. And if she's around the third choice in this race, I think that's value on her. Let's move on to some other circuits now. Let's go all the way across the country to the West Coast in California to discuss the Des Arnaz at Del Mar. This one is going 6.5 furlongs for the 2-year-old fillies. And Craig, this is something we talked about a little bit, how a lot of these 2-year-old stakes races in California so far have come up pretty weak. We mentioned some of those lower speed figures that Princess Noor was receiving, but it wasn't just restricted to her. This crop of 2-year-olds in California has not been so impressive, at least so far during the summer and into the fall. But maybe we're going to start seeing the better horses come out of the woodwork now. And it does feel like this is a higher quality race than even some of the graded stakes that we've been seeing out in California recently. I would imagine the favorite and the substantial favorite is going to be the number 2 Private Mission. This is a filly that took a lot of money in her debut, ran to the hype for Bob Baffert, won basically under a light hand ride. So these are the kind of horses that get people talking, but she is stepping up in class here.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much she is actually stepping up in class. In name, she certainly is. But I mean, this is a field with 8 horses, and it's basically a non-winners of one allowance. Every horse has just a maiden win to their credit. 3 of those horses actually come off of wins on the turf. So I do think she's clearly the horse to beat. Private Mission, she ran well enough her first time out. She got a 99. She tracked a fast pace, took over, and won pretty easily. So there's no reason to think she can't jump in the stakes competition. I do have a little bit of reservations as a couple horses have run back from her race and regressed a little bit on the speed figures. The runner-up came back, was runner-up again, dropped 7 points on her figure, and then another also dropped quite a bit more. So I'm not going to put a ton of stock in that. I do think it was a good effort by Private Mission, but I'm going to look to beat her, and the horse I'm going to look to do it with is Astute. She's one of those horses that actually ran first out on turf for Richard Mandela. She won pretty easily, not easily, but she showed high speed that day. And I actually think, digging through her breeding, that she's a filly who might just be better on dirt anyway. I mean, she's by Speightstown, which we know his progeny have certainly had no trouble handling dirt. And she's a half to multiple graded stakes winner on dirt, Classic Point, one of those sprinting, and the inside information at Gulfstream, and another 1-turn mile in New York. So the breeding's certainly there. She got a 96 for that turf effort. So if I'm looking to beat the favorite, which I will do, since I do have a little bit of reservations, it would be with Astute.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think Private Mission's way the horse to beat, as do you. These are the kind of horses that do seem to win a lot for Bob Baffert, but they also take a lot of money. And when you look up the stats for these horses, when Bob runs them back in stakes races off maiden victories, he'll win at a high percentage, but the ROI is... it doesn't make you want to bet these horses, let's say. She might be okay, and she might go on to do some better things because, as I was saying, I think you do want the horses coming out of maiden races in these stakes in California, not the horses that are dropping out of some of the graded stakes races, because you do have a couple of horses in here who did face Princess Noor and finished far behind her. I don't want those horses. I think they're coming out of weak races. So I am looking at those recent maiden breakers, and obviously Private Mission looks tough. I have no real problem with the horse that you are interested in, Astute. I completely agree about the pedigree. Even going deeper into the second and third generation of our family, it's really dirt breeding. So she could handle this surface. And as you said, the Spites Downs do anything. So I think she's interesting. I'm kind of going with that same theme, but looking for maybe even a bigger price. Because I was very interested of those horses that broke their maidens on the turf in the number 1 Plum Sexy. She ran actually on the same day as Astute, just another heat of that race, the slightly slower division, but she ran a very different kind of race, whereas Astute was just all speed every step of the way and hung on. Plum Sexy kind of was a little sluggish early, didn't look like she really knew what she was doing on the far turn, but once Hector Figueroa peeled her out to the middle of the track at the top of the stretch, she just mowed down that field and won off really impressively. She was just flying under the wire that day. Now, maybe she's just a turf horse. I really don't know. If you look at her pedigree, there is maybe a little more turf than anything else. Her second dam is Perfect Sting, who was a winner of the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf going back to, I think, the early 2000s. So it's possible that she's more of a turf horse, but she's a daughter of Munnings, and the Munnings seem to be able to run over anything a lot like the Spites Towns. And Doug O'Neill does okay with horses switching from turf to dirt, not necessarily off maiden wins, but just in general. So she's one that I think, if she gets a little pace to close into, might get a little bit lost in here and could outrun her odds.
Yes, she was the only other horse I had notes on. I was actually going to ask you about her breeding, and you covered that, so feel free to move on. But I have no problems with her at all, and she's going to be a much better price than the horse I talked about.
Let's stick with the 2-year-olds and move over to Laurel Park, where they're running a couple of stakes for 2-year-olds on Saturday. We're not going to talk about the one for the 2-year-old fillies, the Smart Halo, but I thought the one for the males, the James F. Lewis, came up pretty salty group of runners. I mean, not necessarily a high-quality group, but they seem pretty evenly matched. This one's going 6 furlongs on the dirt, by the way. I guess the horse to beat is the number 4 Dalton. He's coming off a big figure race at Monmouth where he was just second to Pick and Time by a nose. Pick and Time did come back to win the Grade 3 Nashua last weekend at Aqueduct, stretching out in distance, so it flatters the form of that race. If you believe that last race out of Dalton, the others are going to have to step up to beat him, but it is just one figure, and other 2-year-olds can improve at this time of year, so I think there are some others to consider.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. That's kind of my New Year's resolution. And for the racing year, for me, that starts the day after the Breeders' Cup. And that I am going to take more shots with 2-year-olds and lightly race 3-year-olds that just don't have the figures but look to improve. So I have no real knocks on Dalton. He's a horse who's improving basically every single time out. He ran that big 100 you've already covered. The race looks legit. So no knocks on him. He's just not going to be much of a price. I also don't have any real knocks on the second choice either. Kenny Had a Notion. He's won his last 2 easily. He's another that's improving every time out, doesn't have to have the lead. But again, there's not going to be a whole lot of value with him. I think he'll be the second choice, just as it is predicted with the morning line. So the horse I'm going to take a shot with as my top pick is Extreme Mayhem. He's a horse who won well from well off the pace first time out over a sloppy track. And, you know, that's something you don't see very often from a 2-year-old. So I thought that was impressive. I think he has more in the tank, and he only ran an 85 that day. But like I've been saying, and we've talked about it for a long time, it's not out of the realm to think these 2-year-olds can jump up 15 or 20 points in one start. And I just really liked what I saw from him visually. So Extreme Mayhem will be my top pick.
Well, Craig, we're agreeing a lot today, and I think it's going to continue into the last race we talk about because I kind of already have an inkling of where you're going to go in there. But sticking with this James F. Lewis for a second, yeah, we're on the same page about Dalton. I mean, he looked great last time. I think the winner of that race, Pick and Time's pretty good. And Dalton got passed in mid-stretch and was really game. He actually tried to come back and win that race. So you want to see that with the 2-year-olds that just have a nose for the wire. And I think he showed that grit and tenacity. So I think he's going to be pretty tough in here. But I do think the most interesting alternative is that same horse that you highlighted, Extreme Mayhem. As you pointed out, he's going to have to run faster. But I like some of the things we saw out of him in his debut. He was off slowly there, was wide on the turn, finished up pretty well. In mid-stretch, it looked like he might draw off by 5 lengths, and he didn't do that. He got up by 2 lengths and just kind of stayed on to the wire. Looked still unprofessional, though, drifting around in mid-stretch. So I think there's room for improvement. And I was looking up the stats for his trainer, McLean Robertson, with horses that won their debuts and are coming back on their second career starts. He's 8 for 31, 26% with a $3.07 ROI. So this is something that he does very well. And I just think if he gets this horse to improve a little bit, he's likely to get a little pace to close into in this race. So he could be the interesting one.
Yeah, that was interesting. You bring up the trainer. He's a guy I actually meant to mention that. I assume he's the guy that normally trains at Canterbury, has had a lot of good Minnesota breds over the years, but he's certainly been moving into bigger circuits and proven that he's a really good trainer, not just at that smaller circuit in Minnesota, but other places as well.
Yeah, I believe he's the trainer of Amy's Challenge. Am I correct about that? And I know
Yes.
that they're based at Delaware over the summer where she runs a little bit. So that's where this horse is shipping in from. Let's finish things up on this podcast at Churchill Downs with that graded stakes that I mentioned at the top of the show. The Mrs. Revere going 1.16 miles on the turf for the 3-year-old fillies. And we talked about the Valley View a little bit when we were discussing that race at Aqueduct. And we've got, I think, 3 or 4 horses coming out of the Valley View in this race, including the top 3 finishers, Stunning Sky, Princess Grace, and How Ironic. They're going to take some money, but maybe the horse to beat is the one on the rail. That's Hendy Woods. She was second to Sharing 2 back in the Edgewood and was just a little overmatched in that grade 1, the QE2 last time. I personally didn't think that Hendy Woods had a big edge over the horses coming out of the Valley View, even though she might be coming out of the tougher races. I think she's gotten pretty good trips, and I wanted to look at some of the Valley View horses.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the pace projector in here. It's a horse, Positive Danger, who's coming out of just an allowance race at Indiana. She's shown on the pace projector having a very clear lead in a race that favors early, and she's a big price. So she's a horse that I'm going to be interested in. I'm not going to make her my top pick because she's obviously got some improving to do, but she's not that far off. And if she's anywhere near that morning line or higher, I will definitely have a bet on her. I'm going to take the opposite view on Hendy Wood. She's actually the horse I prefer in here to the others. Maybe I'm overrating that QE2, but I'm a big fan of Harvey's Little Goyle. I like how she came back and ran in that filly and mare turf to get a third and really improved her figure that day. So I'm wondering, it's always possible I underrated that race a little bit. I agree with you that she's had really good trips, but I just think she might have a class edge and get a good trip again, sitting in behind that Positive Danger. And if that one starts, I think she's one who could trip out again and might just be better than these.
I'm not opposed to that view. And if she's around that 3-1 morning line, I think that she's a viable price at those odds. I don't know. I thought she got a great trip in the QE2. She saved ground on the turns, ankled out, and just kind of came up empty there. Those were better horses. I'm totally on the same page with you about that. I saw some people making a little bit about her trip in the Edgewood. There's a bit of a trouble line there. She did have to steady briefly a couple times just because she was getting a little rank. But all things considered, I thought she got a pretty good trip that day as well. So I don't know. I'm just not her biggest fan. And there's one horse in particular coming out of the Valley View that I'm very interested in, and that's the number 4, Princess Grace. We talked about how Duopoly was a little bit too close to that pace when we were discussing that Aqueduct stakes race earlier, and of the 4 horses coming out of the Valley View, well, 3 of them in this field were bringing up the rear early, Stunning Sky, How Ironic, and Vitez, and they were all doing running at the end, but Princess Grace was way ahead of them. She was somewhere in mid-pack, and she made the first move into that fast pace, really broke the race open in at about the 8th pole, and she ultimately just got a little tired because I think she did move too soon in that race. But she's lightly raced. That was obviously her best effort of her career last time. I think she still has upside for Mike Stidham, and if she's a similar price to Hendy Woods, I was going to rely more on her to take another step forward.
Yeah, I've got no problem with her. She's definitely the horse I prefer the most out of the Valley View. And it would come down to price. If one of them's 3-1 and one's 5-2, I would take the 3-1 one. I do want to talk about, since you brought up the trip of Hendy Woods in the Edgewood, that's a case where, as a guy who uses pace figures, when I look at the pace of that race, most of her trouble came early in the race when the pace was moderate and the horses weren't doing a whole lot of running anyway. So I'm just not going to put a whole lot of stock in that. I'm much more concerned with horses having trouble when the race is at its quickest part. And in this case, that would have been later in the race. If it was a race that was highlighted in red fractions and she was running into trouble while trying to move, I'd probably look at it a little bit differently. But I'm considering that basically a good trip overall that day.
And just to kind of wrap up this race, Stunning Sky's the morning line favorite, and she might be the favorite. She's coming off that victory in the Valley View. I'm just not this filly's biggest fan. She gets very good trips in her races typically, or she has in her recent starts, and she got a huge pace to close into last time. She really got a very similar trip to How Ironic, who was a big long shot in that race, and you can look at How Ironic's prior form, but coming into that Valley View, I don't think you'd want to bet her in this race off that form. So I'm a little bit against her, and I prefer the horses with a bit more tactical speed.
Yeah, same for me. I just think she got an absolutely dream trip last time. Like I said, that's a race worth pulling up the chart and just looking where the horses that finished in the top 3 were. And Princess Grace really stands out to me, as she did to you. It'll be an interesting contest to see how those two races, the Valley View and the QE2, stack up.
I completely agree. Well, that's all the racing we have to discuss this week. Kind of a bit of a quiet weekend on the racing circuit, as far as it goes to the stakes racing. But we'll find some things to talk about when we recap these races on the Pacecast next week. I'm sure there's going to be some interesting maiden allowance racing happening around the country. We've got a lot of 2-year-olds coming out of the woodwork at this time of year. So we'll search through the figures and find some things to talk about when we do our TimeformUS Pacecast next week, as we look to get on a bit of a more regular schedule with these. Breeders' Cup week and everything else going on kind of threw us off for a little bit, but we're trying to get back to the 2 podcasts a week that we had become accustomed to earlier and over this summer. So thanks for listening this week. Remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Forum channel. Thanks for tuning in, and look for the TimeformUS Pacecast on Tuesday.